Okay, are we playing the... Woohoo! Welcome to the Energy Realities podcast. Today we have the master of absurdities, David Blackmon, the satirical Stu Turley, and myself, Tammy Nemeth. The ever-witty Irina Slav is not with us today. She's on a road trip, having fun without us. And it's a good thing she's not in Canada, because she'd get screamed at by the Liberal Party for killing the planet or something if you go on a road trip. But today we have like a super special guest, the very enigmatic Doomberg. Doomberg has the #1 finance letter on Substack, and he's here to chat with us today about what the heck's going on in Europe and maybe tying it in with other energy reality developments. So, hello, Doomberg. Welcome to the program.
Tammy, David, Stu, great to be with you. It's too bad that Irina couldn't make it. I'm a big fan of her Substack. I remember when she first started, and try to do our best to support her work as well. And I know she supports ours, but looking forward to a fantastic discussion today.
Yeah, that's so great. We're so happy to have you here. I'm a longtime follower and really appreciate your insights. And, you know, one of the things I think maybe if Stu wants to put them up, you had a couple of really great Substack posts. And the one in particular on May 24th about the upcoming EU elections and the EU Green Deal, those were really interesting. And you made this great point about language, and it's something that Irina and I have been talking about before on this podcast and elsewhere. And it's like anyone who disagrees with the EU Green Deal or the trajectory, they're labeled hard right, far right, a Putin stooge, and so on. And I'm wondering what are the connections there between this abuse of language, really, and, as you say, the incompatibility of the green agenda with democracy.
Sure, yeah. So the piece, as you mentioned, was called "Apart at the Seams," and we speculated that the sort of myopic fascination with renewables and disconnecting society from fossil fuels and nuclear energy was fundamentally incompatible with democracy, and I'll explain why. But also might be a catalyst for the eventual breakup of the European Union. Now, it should be said that people have been calling for the breakup or predicting the breakup of the European Union for as long as there has been the European Union project. But I do think we are nearing a potential political break point. So let me explain the core thesis of the piece, which is that the green energy revolution, quote unquote, is fundamentally incompatible with democracy. So what do I mean by that? And what did we mean by that when we wrote it? At its core, fossil fuels and nuclear energy are needed to maintain a good standard of living. Energy is life, after all. And if you disconnect from those energy resources, it necessarily follows, and the data supports, that practically everywhere it's been tried, standards of living begin to decrease. And shockingly, people don't like it when their standards of living decrease. And in a one vote per person democracy, elections are popularity contests. And it's embedded right in the word populism. These are politicians who then take advantage of an upset population. And the ruling class, which is far more pronounced in Europe than, say, in the US, although the US is trending in this direction as well, cares less and less about what the people think. For example, the current form of the European Union is nothing that was contemplated when the citizens of Europe voted to join or not join or to ratify various treaties. I mean, they've just walked over everything that was sort of promised that the European Union would not become. And so there's a long track record of ignoring the population in Europe. And this myopic focus on the Green New Deal is really driving a populism uprising of the quote unquote hard right, far right. And the other bit of semantics that we talked about in the piece, of course, is that there's this descriptor in front of the word democracy that's called our democracy, which is meant to convey that if you vote incorrectly, we have to save democracy from the voters, is literally coming out of the mouths of certain leaders in Europe. And this can't go on forever. That which can't go on forever usually doesn't. And one wonders whether the upcoming European parliamentary elections aren't going to be a decisive turning point. We shall see. The members of the hard right, far right of Europe have been stubbing their toes a little bit in the closing days leading up to this election. But by and large, populism derives from when people are unhappy. Democracies are popularity contests. And so therefore, in order to implement the Green New Deal, you need to become more centrally planned, more of a dictatorial government style where the will of the people is overridden by the bureaucrats in Brussels. And that's not a recipe for stability in our view.
That's a really good point, because like I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, maybe even 4 years ago, Eric Heyman, who's a analyst at Deutsche Bank, wrote a piece called they need an honest conversation about the Green Deal, because it's all the recipe for a climate dictatorship. And you almost have to have that in order to bring about all of the different elements that are introduced with the Green Deal. David, what do you think of Doomberg's comments there?
Well, I think he's spot on. I mean, every policy solution advanced in Europe and the United States, Canada, trying to subsidize this energy transition into being is authoritarian in nature. And that is completely incompatible with democratic governance and the will of the people, and the will of the people's very often thwarted. And I think that in Europe, it's especially pronounced, probably advanced a little further than it is in the United States, but we're heading in the same direction here, aren't we, Doomberg?
Yeah, so one thing I should say, which we've written about in a prior piece, at the core of the Green New Deal is what we call the big lie. And the big lie is that you can decouple from fossil fuels with no impact on your standard of living.
Right.
And that's just fundamentally not true. It has been repeated enough times that the young generation who are being indoctrinated in our universities believe it. But it's fundamentally physics. It would say otherwise. And whatever's going on in the West, 2 + 2 is still 4, and it'll always be 4. Physics is physics, math is math, and we can deny it. I like to say Greenpeace is a physics denier, for example, given their opposition to nuclear energy. We could deny it all we want, but it doesn't mean that ultimately it won't come to pass. Your standard of living is defined by how much energy you get to harvest, and secondarily, how efficiently you harvest that energy in order to impose order on your local environment. The human endeavor is a constant, unrelenting struggle against the forces of entropy. You need to waste heat in order to create local order in your environment. And the more heat you get to waste, the richer you are. Yeah. It's just that simple. And so unless and until the leaders in charge come to grips with that fundamental axiom, we are going to be in a place where, for example, Justin Trudeau is 20 points down in the polls, and on the back of a very small fringe minority party has maintained power far longer than the population would like him to. And he is implementing all manner of energy and social policies that are meant to reduce Canadian standards of living and to increase the control over the federal government over everyday lives of the Canadian citizens. And this is, in many ways, a carbon copy of what's going on in Australia, California. And what amazes me is that people can look at what happened to Germany and think this is something to strive for.
No.
Yeah.
I don't understand it. It just makes so little sense. But if there was an election held today, Trudeau would get wiped out. It would be a historic wipeout. The Liberal Party, for those who aren't familiar with Canadian politics, is kind of like the Democratic Party in Canada. It's kind of always in charge. Once in a while, they let a Conservative in for a little bit. But if you look at the last 100 years of Canadian politics, it's been the Liberal Party, both at the federal and in many of the important provincial levels. And Canada is not a country necessarily that will stay together either. I mean, everybody thinks about the Quebec issue, but there's also the Alberta issue. And the Alberta issue is relevant to this discussion because Alberta, and to a lesser extent Saskatchewan and British Columbia, but the Western provinces produce an enormous amount of energy, and they are supporting the Atlantic provinces, for example, with transfer payments because all of the profits in Canada are made out west, and then the socialization, the social system, the social safety net that Canada has is paid for basically by Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and to a lesser extent Ontario. But in the end, these are unstable situations, and I can tell you that in Alberta, Justin Trudeau is not a very popular person.
No.
But we have a paradox going on between Tammy's two countries, Canada and the UK. In the UK, the Conservative government is trailing the Liberal Party by 20 points, right? How do we account for that? I mean, it looks like the UK is about to dump the conservative Tory government, although it hasn't really been conservative, in favor of the Liberals. So how do we account for that counterintuitive movement in the UK?
I don't want to speak for Tammy, but
It's a uniparty.
It's a uniparty system.
Yeah.
There's no difference between the parties. They're just
Yeah.
shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. Look, the UK is best modeled as an emerging economy. I mean, it truly is amazing to watch. Again, it doesn't produce hardly any of its own energy. And if you don't produce your own energy, you are susceptible to the whims of the people who do.
Yeah, absolutely. Stu, what's your comments on all this?
I got to make sure I'm not throwing us off the air for my opinions today, but Mr. Doomberg in Spain, your article has a great bunch of numbers in here. In Spain on Wednesday confirmed plans to close the country's nuclear plants by 2035. And we're seeing that around the world. Take a look at California's Diablo Canyon. They're going to shut it down, and now it's, I'm not quite dead yet, kind of like the Monty Python's, getting an arrow in the chest. He's not quite dead yet. But yet France has got the same thing. They had a nuclear fleet of 50 reactors. They had that before. They now only have 25 of them because they never spent any maintenance on the nuclear reactors. And now they're going, well, we might need them.
So the Spain situation is a bit weird because it runs in the face of the trend of the rest of the world. And there's even some discussion in Germany about perhaps this might have been a mistake. Again, like the NDP, like the NDP in Canada, the Green Party in Germany as a minority party coalition member has had a disproportionate impact on German politics relative to their popularity at the polls. But the socialist prime minister of Spain, having observed what happened to Germany, has decided that he would like to replicate that in his country. One suspects that we are at an election away from that being overturned in Spain. And you speak of Diablo Canyon. I give Governor Gavin Newsom credit for saving Diablo Canyon. I give Gretchen Whitmer credit in Michigan for trying her hardest to reopen Palisades, which looks like it might happen. If we talk about sort of the optimistic lens, we're writing a piece, perhaps the one after the one that comes out tomorrow, on what Jennifer Granholm had to say at the new nuclear reactor in Georgia, which was very interesting. Tentative title for our piece is 198 to go, which is a direct quote from Jennifer Granholm. Credit to the Biden administration for having an about face on nuclear energy. And then we're going to get into that piece for what's actually required to do it. But we have learned the nuclear advocacy movement, which is a small, tight-knit community that is very effective, much more effective than the nuclear industry itself, I would say, has proven that the closure of nuclear reactors in the U.S. can now be prevented. And even though the Vogtle nuclear reactor was a disaster from a budget and a timing perspective, the deep lessons were learned from there. And now the big step is we need to prove that the U.S. can build new nuclear reactors in a timely way.
I have to give a shout out to David Blackmon, RT Trevino, and the Americans for Prosperity for last week. Last week, Senator Ted Cruz, I was in the meeting with him, he stood up, and the folks from the Texas Christian University and David Douglas, the name of the
Doug Robinson, Venture Resources. Yeah,
I've got a call out to him, and the DOE is not giving them what they need to turn on their next reactor because, and Senator Cruz said, hold that thought. And he goes, I'll get involved. Go Senator Ted Cruz. I thought that was out of the park huge, that we have new nuclear reactors and there's still a holdup.
So we have to work through those issues. I've long argued that the quote unquote expense of nuclear is a political decision. You know, the environmental left has done everything in their power to delay, diminish, use lawfare tactics, sue for permits that have already been issued, and then sue again, and make it difficult to finance these projects and so on. Look, if France could build out its nuclear fleet in the 70s, and if Canada could do it, then surely the U.S. can get its act together. And that's going to be the thrust of the piece, what we would need to do.
The UAE?
The UAE did it. They just turned on their 4th reactor. Canada has done, Canada's the can-do system. All the things we need. And we had James Crownstein on one of our Doom Zoom for our pro tier a couple of months ago. He's a brilliant expert, grew up in the nuclear industry. He did a great 4 podcast series with Decouple on the lessons learned from the Georgia construction and what the U.S. needs to do to satisfy the vision that Jennifer Granholm laid out while visiting there. And it really comes down to picking a standardized design and sticking with it, rebuilding a domestic nuclear supply chain, and training up the next generation of nuclear workers.
That's
these are all choices. And the sooner we get going on those, the better. We're pondering something that's very interesting that we believe is the driving force behind much of this. We predicted this last year, I believe, that the AI revolution needs it, and the tech industry, Silicon Valley, venture capital world has way more pull with government than the fringe environmental movement does. And so something has to give. Now, one of the things that we're pondering, and we're not quite sure we'll write about it, but it's in the sort of birthing phase, is we might see something very, very interesting. So we take note of the rally in utility stocks, and we often try to ponder what the market is telling us. I think we could see, for example, I don't think the lack of new capacity is going to slow the AI build out in the US. They'll just pay more. And that's going to cause substantially. So fundamentally, one of the things that we've been pondering a lot internally is, what is electricity worth? Electricity is not worth what we pay for it. It's a public good whose price is held artificially low for good reason, because it has become a central part of our modern standard of living. So if I had to pay 3 times the current electricity cost to keep my house with 100% reliability, I could afford that, and I would do that, because electricity is so central to our lives. But it is not worth 11 cents a kilowatt hour or 20 cents a kilowatt hour. It's worth a lot more than that, which is what we find out when the power goes out. Right. And so, for example, just for operating our business, we write and do our podcast appearances from an office that we have acquired for the task. And our job is to be on the internet. So I need electricity, right? Like, what is my electricity at this office worth? It's worth a hell of a lot more than 20 cents a kilowatt hour to us. Yeah. And so the AI revolution might drive an incredibly uncomfortable price discovery in the electricity market in ways that we are not prepared for yet. And the consequences of that is something that we are contemplating as we speak.
Doomberg, you talk about things putting pressure on the Biden administration to move more aggressively to nuclear. Isn't the failure of the offshore wind experiment they've done a big part of that? Did you see the Westwood analysis that was released over the weekend that shows globally the offshore floating wind sector is only going to be able to add 3 to 10 gigawatts of new projects between now and 2030. And the Biden administration's goal for the U.S. alone is 30 gigawatts.
Yeah, that's
so obviously that's not going to happen, and that just puts more pressure to move rapidly to nuclear, doesn't it?
Well, look, 30 gigawatts of wind compared to Jennifer Granholm's 200 gigawatts of nuclear are vastly different things if you just look at the capacity factors, right?
Right. So, and efficiency factors.
Right. So the percent of time that wind is available, and by the way, intermittency is incompatible with the needs of AI and data servers.
Right.
And so I think, for example, if the capacity factor of wind, let's give it a healthy 50%, and we'll just say nuclear is 100 just to make it easy. In order for offshore wind to match just the integral of electricity, never mind the stability of it, you would need 400 gigawatts of wind, or more than 13 times what is being proposed, which won't happen.
Right.
And the wind industry has suffered from a lot of its own mistakes, and so we are deeply bearish the long-term outlook for offshore wind in particular. And so
the poor whales already have toe tags on their flippers. And you try to put that many more towers out there, and it's going to kill.
It never really made sense to us that this is what we should be doing. And all of these cockamamie Rube Goldberg machines about how we're going to take wind and we're going to make hydrogen and then we're going to make ammonia and then we're going to ship it on a boat and we're going to send it to Germany, when they have perfectly operable nuclear power plants, and they have ammonia reactors there that are sitting idle, and they could just split water with nuclear power and do it right there.
Right.
But I digress.
Yeah, I know.
These are luxuries of the rich, and they come at the expense of the masses, which is why, again, this is all fundamentally incompatible with democracy. No sane person would decouple from fossil fuels and nuclear energy and turn to offshore wind, especially after observing what has happened in Europe. It's just so puzzling to me. But it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, France is an interesting case because they, like Stu had said and David had said, that they had let their fleet kind of diminish and not necessarily maintain it properly. And when Macron was first elected, he talked about they were going to phase it out. And then, reality kind of jumped in there and it was like, oh, no, you can't. You're actually going to need more. And I think they sensed an opportunity there because there's a lot of talk about interconnections and how France then can be the battery basically for Europe, right? Where they'll have all these interconnections and France will be raking in the dough, selling their electricity to all of these other jurisdictions and perhaps be able to use that as leverage for certain things because they're France.
That brings up a very good point. Europe is driving towards interconnectivity, which is actually quite useful.
Yeah.
And the biggest battery in the world, I believe, is actually the Norwegian hydroelectric dam system. And the Norwegians are kind of playing the role of allowing for intermittency. This is an interesting potential solution that could dampen the negative consequences of too much solar and wind, but it's not something that can be replicated here. We're tearing down dams in the US. Nobody's talking about. The only place in the world that is trying to replicate this is Quebec, which we wrote about as well. And, New York shut down Indian Point and then now is turning to Hydro-Quebec to fill that gap. And we talked about the damage of the St. James Bay project. Hydro is a great example to counter the narrative about nuclear and safety and all this nonsense. You can't find a single person in the world who's ever been injured by nuclear waste, period.
Right.
One death has been linked to the Fukushima accident. The person died of cancer a couple of years later, I believe, and it was officially categorized as a death that resulted from Fukushima. In China, there was a generational storm that caused a huge hydroelectric dam to collapse in the 1970s, and it's estimated that 250,000 people may have died. As we highlighted up in Quebec, they dammed the St. James rivers, the Grand Riviere is dammed up, the St. James Bay project. It killed countless caribou. It totally destroyed entire communities. These are the one word that the comparison between hydro and nuclear brings up that is far too often missing from the energy debate is trade-off. Yes, Quebec produces an enormous amount of electricity. It exports an enormous amount to New York. It's in Quebec, by the way. It's not your electricity bill, it's your hydro bill. It's part of their culture. But in so doing, we have displaced all manner of indigenous people, disrupted vast areas of precious natural landscape. There's a trade-off. Quebec made that trade-off. When you consider the trade-offs of nuclear power, you have this virtually limitless supply of ultra-reliable baseload power. And even the term nuclear waste is a false moniker because in reality, what the progressives characterize as nuclear waste is in fact future generations worth of fuel. We only take and use 5% of the embodied energy in a pound of uranium, fuel. And you could run these through fast breeder reactors and recycle them and extract more and more of the energy. And so we have all of the technology to do that. And so nuclear waste is a gift to future generations of engineers. And so there's practically no trade-off. Yes, there's some minor, minuscule meltdown risk. But even when it happens, like again, how many people are dying every day on the battlefield in Ukraine and Russia? There are trade-offs. We have to analyze them. We have to be intelligent about them. But we have this wholly overblown fear of radiation that has stunted the industry. And look, credit to the radicals who have successfully connected the civilian nuclear energy with the total thermonuclear war. Like in the minds of many people, these are not readily distinguished.
It looks like we just had Tammy.
We just lost Tammy.
Speaking of Ukraine, your article on Ukraine mapping the war, how to understand what's really going on in Ukraine, May 28th. What were your thoughts on that?
So the primary purpose of that article really didn't have much to do with the war in Ukraine. It has to do with how is it that if citizens who want to be informed, how can they go about separating the noise and the signal on the internet? We all are bathed in propaganda. And,
Really?
and this is especially true during times of war. And we have spent a lot of time reading the propaganda of the West and the propaganda in Ukraine and the propaganda in Russia and the propaganda in China. And they all tell vastly different stories, right? And for example, in Russia and China today, they speak openly as though they were already involved in World War III with the West. And this is what is being told to their citizens. And so mapping the war was about how do we in the West, who are subject to our own biases and propaganda, if all you do is get your news from the New York Times and the Economist and the BBC, you have a vastly different view of what's going on in the war than if you try to find out for yourself what's going on. And one of the things that, given its critical connection to the energy sector, we decided at the beginning of the year to do a deep dive into this phenomenon of online mappers who trace down to the street and building level the ever-changing flow of the line of combat contact. And the interesting thing that has transpired in this community is everybody has a bias. So we opened that piece making fun of Peter Zeihan for his often bombastic takes, and the caption to the piece that we had, to the picture of him we had in that piece was never in doubt. But if you look, if the same event is just portrayed in radically different ways, but when it comes to the movement of the front line in the war, there's a whole ecosystem of people who track every day using geolocated videos, satellite data, interviews with reporters and soldiers on the ground. And there's pro-Ukrainian mappers. We profiled one. There's a more neutral mapper, and then there's a pro-Russian mapper. And the interesting thing is this ecosystem is self-correcting, because if one of the maps is way out of sync with the others, then they lose credibility. And so, for example, if a Russian advance is claimed by the pro-Russian mapper and the pro-Ukrainian mappers consolidate and agree that that has actually happened, then you could be pretty sure that that's pretty close to the truth. And so what that allows one to do as an independent citizen is learn for yourself the trends in the war, and then listen to the media and how they describe it. And then since you have some indication of what the truth is, you can then properly classify whatever propaganda source that you're consuming your information from as reliable or inconsistent with what you know to be true. And this has been very insightful for us. And one of the things that we have learned is that by doing so, by keeping abreast of the daily movements, just the daily movements in the line of combat contact, you can get a week or two ahead of the news. So for example, in the past week, we have noticed that that the Ukrainians have been able to slow the advance of Russian troops at a pace that was not consistent with what was going on before the latest batch of weapons were approved. And in fact, overnight, we see some pretty interesting counterattacks by the Ukrainians on the northern front. And all of this talk about whether or not permission has been given to the Ukrainians to use Western weapons on, pre-2014 Russian territory. This was the talk of the mapping world 3 weeks ago. You could see this coming. So you get ahead of the news. And you get ahead of the news and you have a relatively independent way to categorize various news outlets for their relative accuracy. And as a free-thinking person, when I read 1984 as a child, which I regret having done, I made the commitment that I would be a free-thinking person. I would try my best to never. No, we all get caught up in it, right? But by and large,
be a free-thinking person, but then I got married.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole separate talk show.
Yes, it certainly is.
But this mapping the war piece was more about, look, just because somebody's biased doesn't mean it's not useful information. It's useful to know what the Russians are telling themselves. It's useful to know what the Europeans are telling themselves. It's useful to know what the Ukrainians are telling themselves. But the one kernel of truth that you can independently verify for yourself is the actual momentum on the battlefield. And I think the fact that Russia's momentum has stalled a little bit is testimony to the impact of the Western weapons. And it's an input into how you read the news.
Doomberg, do you see a similar avenue for people to get real information about energy, get beyond the propaganda we see in our legacy media outlets around energy and energy transition and get the real information?
It's an interesting question. I think it's there to be had. I mean, Substack, for example, is a great spot. Everybody has their biases, of course. We're very biased, and we admit them, and we try to be humble enough to admit when we're wrong, for example. But we did an interesting survey, which is we sort of had a way to estimate who our ideal clients are. You could just sort of peruse your subscriber list. We have 235,000 subscribers now, and Substack has this way of rating your subscribers 1 through 5 stars. And so if you just take a look at our paying subscribers, which are a small subset of that 235,000, it should be said, a healthy subset, one that we're very grateful for, but it's not like all 235,000 people are paying subscribers.
Yeah.
Our best subscribers, if we sort of model what those people are, and we figured out a way that you could sort of check and see what kind of market penetration do we have. And we estimate that maybe 2 or 3 out of 1,000 potential ideal clients for Doomberg are aware of the Doomberg brand. We have a long ways to go. We estimate that the addressable market for Doomberg is probably 20 million emails. And so we're just scratching the surface with Substack. The media revolution, we live in it, we bathe in it. But we're investors in Substack for that reason. Substack is a fraction of the size of Facebook and Instagram. I think they probably have 30 or 40 million emails in their ecosystem, whereas there's 1 billion people on Facebook. Substack is a fascinating platform. It's a very strong proponent of free speech. The founders of Substack are friends of ours. We've gotten to know them. We've met them in person. They're big supporters of Doomberg. And we invested in their author-led round with a pretty sizable check because we believe in what they're doing. And I just wanted to disclose that because I think you should disclose when you have a financial conflict. Right. But like hardly anybody knows. Like when people ask us what we do and we explain, oh, what's Substack? That happens all the time. And again, we're probably 2 to 3% down the road to what's possible. And look, Substack's not the only way, but it's very hard for people on social media to not succumb to the algorithm. The 2 things that are very different about Substack versus Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, especially TikTok, is there is no algorithm, and it is a subscriber-focused platform, not an advertisement-focused platform. Individual Substack authors can run ads on their newsletters if they would like, but there is no Substack ad like you have on YouTube. I like to describe Substack as YouTube for writers, but driven by subscriptions instead of ads. And there's no algorithm. So you can select into whoever you would like to read. And that's pretty unique. They put the power of the platform in the hands of the creators. So for example, take the Doomberg Substack. We have limited comments to paying subscribers. And every time we publish a piece, we get several hundred comments. And I personally am in the comments section after we publish a piece, responding to as many comments as I can directly.
Yeah.
And this is both a feature for our subscribers, but also it is a relatively civil environment for discourse. Now, critics would say that you're creating an echo chamber and all these other things. It's a fair trade in my view. And by the way, we will occasionally delete a comment that, like, we shepherd the comments, and we demand civility from our subscribers, and we've had to ban a few people, maybe 2 in the 2 years that we've been behind the paywall. But
Wow.
we hear all the time from our subscribers how much they enjoy the comments, because people go in and they share links, and here's some more. Or our favorite is when we write about something we don't know. Like, for example, our latest piece, it was on cancer, and we have been debating whether to diversify into the medical field for a long time. And this was our first sort of foray into something that we've spent an enormous amount of time researching, which is the field of cancer. And the pinned comment under our piece is somebody who has 20 years of experience in the area, who validated basically everything we wrote, which is great for us because we're not in that space. But when somebody who has, the direct expertise validates what we've written, that is very, it's good for the brand. It's good for our work. And it encourages us to do more. And there were so many links and interesting analyses sent by our subscribers. And then we reached sort of a network effect where most of our pieces now are ideas that were submitted to us by our subscribers. And we know we have an expert network to consult people in various topics once we get a piece up and running. And so Substack is really changing. They have this mission, and Chris, the CEO of Substack, is kind of, interesting fellow. I like him a lot. He when we were there in San Francisco for the author-led investing round, he said that their goal is to change the way people use the internet. And it's a bit grandiose, but it actually is true. It does change the way you.
Did your green chicken suit itch while you were in that meeting? I was just kind of confusing because when David and I had you live at NAPE, boy, there was a line for people to get a signature from you.
Yeah. We do occasionally make appearances as ourselves. We're a very small team. The Green Chicken is all about brand. It was about brand in the beginning. It was how we had a growth hack on Twitter. And we have observed that when brands de-anonymize, they tend to collapse the brand value. Hundreds and hundreds of people know who we are in real life and know that we're Doomberg, and it's not like some giant secret. But it is important to the brand, and it worked. And we also just like it, and it's kind of just the way we choose to identify. And I think you're seeing more and more people do this, by the way. And I think this is the trend, right? Because don't forget, there's also like cancel culture, right? If you don't know who the person is, then you kind of have to confront the ideas, which I think is powerful. And we're more than happy to defend our ideas. We're happy to change our mind. We're happy to have a civilized discourse. We'll debate anybody, anywhere, anytime, unless they're trolls and they've been vulgar. Then we just don't engage. But we're trying to lead by example on having civilized discussions about important topics with fact-based analysis and an open mind. And this is the way it used to be. And it'd be great if we got back to that, So.
Sure would.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, so what do you make of what the Netherlands new coalition has proposed with respect to energy? It looks like they want to reopen a bunch of the natural gas fields, and they want to kind of roll back some of the net zero things. What do you make of their announcements?
Yeah, this is the beginning of the sort of counterpunch, the snapping of the rubber band. Again, back to the piece, a part of the seams. What they were trying to do to the farmers in that country, what's going on in Ireland. It's pretty amazing, actually. Like the thing let's just take Ireland, for example. I know you asked me about the Netherlands, but the Netherlands, Ireland, they could cut their emissions to zero. Nobody would care. Nobody would notice. It would be within the measurement error. And the rest of the world would greedily lap up whatever fossil fuels they are foregoing. And it would just be slightly cheaper for them to do so. There's nothing going on in Europe today that's going to affect the climate, period. It boggles the mind that they think they can. that 5 million people in Ireland is going to be, that's a pimple on a horse compared to China, right? China putting, what, 200 gigawatts of coal in the next, I mean, who are we kidding? The world is going to roll the dice on carbon emissions, period. The gating function for carbon emissions is not consumption, it's production. Because Doomberg's postulate states that every molecule of fossil fuels produced will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions against such activities merely change who gets to enjoy that privilege. And by the way, Europe produces no fossil fuels. I mean, Norway and the UK are not in the European Union. The European Union produces practically no natural gas, practically no oil, and a little bit of coal because of Germany and Poland. The world doesn't care what Europe does. Like, Europe can restrict itself all it wants. It's just going to shift who gets the benefit of burning those fossil fuels. It's crazy to me that they can't see this. Now, if Australia stopped producing coal, that would actually impact carbon emissions. If Canada stopped producing coal, oil, and natural gas, that would impact carbon emissions. It would also drive the price of those commodities through the roof and probably cause popular revolts, first in the emerging economies, but eventually in the West, as we're seeing already. But the gating function of emissions is consumption, is production, not consumption. If we, like, the U.S. is still, it's the largest producer of oil the world has ever seen. It produces 30 to 35% of the world's natural gas. It's a net exporter of coal. It has 90 nuclear reactors. And this is why, by the way, the environmentalists are always trying to stop production. But what Ireland, what the Netherlands do is irrelevant to the climate.
Well said. But that's the same for so many Western countries.
So for our podcast listeners, sometimes we have to remember this is also on voice. Climate, this is from Messy Times. Climate, sorry, did someone say climate? Aren't we all going to die because of carbon? I wear my hip waders all day long just in case the sea level rises. What a great compliment.
So on that point, this is a really important one. And I had a pretty infamous debate with Professor Stephen Keen a while back, which was interesting. If you want to listen to it, just Google Doomberg Stephen Keen. It was on Jack Crowley's show, I believe. And my main point in that debate was, because he was very much in the camp that we are, in a barrel heading over Niagara Falls on climate. And I was like, well, brace for impact, because we're going to do it. And by the way, if you've been saving that special bottle of wine, if the world is truly going to end, you should open it up and enjoy it while you still can. Because we are going to roll the dice on climate. Indonesia, Pakistan, India, China, they don't care about the climate change. They're happy to take incremental fossil fuels at a slightly cheaper price and use them for their own domestic purposes. But they're not going to, they are not going to refuse their population's right to climb Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They're going to develop. And if you look at the global south, the 6 billion people that's in the global south, let's say, they could double or triple their net BTU per GDP, BTU per capita numbers, and would still live at a fraction of what we enjoy in the West today. I mean, who are we to tell them they can't develop? They're not going to listen to, bureaucrats in Brussels or professors at elite universities.
Nor should they.
Who believe that sawing the trunk to save the branch is a good strategy. It's not going to happen. And so we're going to roll the dice on climate change. And our view, which is one we've held for a very long time, is that money dedicated towards dealing with climate change would be best spent on reacting to it than clumsily trying to alter the course of the climate, which is a classically chaotic system. And so, sea levels rise, great. Let's invest to abate that. There's not much more you can do.
I think we would be better off, sorry, Mr. Doomberg, I think we'd be better off spending more money instead of climate change and fear-mongering and actually renewable in making, recyclable real. because right now recycling is a facade and a make you feel good, because you put all your trash in a blue or a green can and it goes to the same place, and it is actually a joke.
So this falls into the category of pollution control, which is different than climate.
Exactly.
And we would be all for pollution controls. In fact, one of the pieces we wrote called Geopolitical Warfare highlights a fundamental problem with the way in which we manage our industry and the way in which China does. So when China decides it wishes to dominate a strategic industry, they do not let environmental concerns get in the way. So I've been in industries where China has decided they want to monopolize it. I was in the solar industry when the West had to shut down all of its production, because look, when your competitor's idea of a water treatment facility is a pipeline to the river, you cannot compete on cost. And I remember being presented with a request for proposal by a big name brand, that a B2C company that you all would recognize, that has really beautiful booths at the various COP meetings and climate change meetings and so on, and telling this procurement person that China has stolen our intellectual property and they're not abiding by globally acceptable environmental standards, when they're telling you that the price for the product I'm supposed to compete against is 30% less than me. And this person looked at me and said, "That's for the courts to decide. Are you going to meet the bid or not?" And we didn't. And this is how China came to dominate the polysilicon industry. This is why solar is cheap. There's not some S-curve of innovation nonsense that Kathy Wood likes to talk about. It's because China decided it wanted to own solar. It flooded the world with cheap solar panels. Look, even if we have a polysilicon plant, and I think the US still has 3, 98% of the world's polysilicon gets formed into ingots in China and sliced into wafers in China and then mounted as cells. This is all happening in China. It's all commingled with slave labor polysilicon from the western parts of China. And so every single solar panel in the world has Chinese forced labor in it, for example. Period. Just does. There's no getting around that. No amount of greenwashing of your supply chain can change that fact. But China decided to dominate the industry. They steal intellectual property, and they have no environmental safeguards. So if we allow this to continue, the net effect is we don't have clean production in the Western world. We have no production in the Western world, because we have environmental standards, which we should enforce, which basically involve pollution controls. And industry after industry wrote a piece about magnesium. I believe it was called Magnesium PI. I have this photographic memory for the pieces that we've written. There used to be a giant magnesium plant in Texas, in Freeport, and it's out of business now. China owns that market now. Why? Because magnesium is pretty dirty business, and to do it well, to do it cleanly, is expensive. We have decided, because of Wall Street and quarterly expectations and stock options for management, that we will forego robustness in the name of efficiency. But in reality, that efficiency is a mirage. We are creating brittle supply chains controlled by our geopolitical adversaries in the name of quarterly profits incentives on Wall Street. And this is known. It's done on purpose by China. They do it over and over again. We've written about electric vehicles. We've written about AI. We've written about semiconductors. The pattern is very clear. We allow it to happen over and over again. And so, and I know you asked about recycling, and I went on a tangent about pollution, but we can recycle, and we do recycle. The U.S. has an amazing recycling system, and not all of it goes into the same landfills. I know that's a bit of an urban myth, but I happen to know some people in the waste management industry. They do heroic work. When you look at all the plastic in the ocean, none of that's coming from the U.S. It's all coming from Asia. Right?
Yes.
And I'm starting to work with another group because we try to do a lot of stuff in my day job with some folks. Hey, Robert, we love Robert. And so there are companies that are out there that are now coming to the forefront that have the processes to take wind blades and recycle them now. It's just got to get the capital in order to do that. And then solar panels, we can now recycle those, but it's economics. And then we have, is it land reclamation? Doomberg, I really want everybody to take a look. Land reclamation for abandoned oil wells is in a process and they're doing a greater job. Are they perfect? No. Is it governed and is it managed? Yes. Are they trying? Yes. Wind farms, we are in a holy smokes, Batman. Who's going to pay for this crap?
So
That to me is huge.
it's worse than you think.
Yes, it is.
Because what happened is the wind industry conspired with members of Congress to insert into law a IRS incentive that if they quote unquote upsized or upgraded their wind turbines, they could get an extension on the tax credits.
Yeah.
And so what happened was all of these perfectly operable wind turbines, the blades on those were taken off long before end of life and shoved into these landfills because it's actually very difficult to recycle turbines. And in fact, here's the fundamental issue with recycling. Our view is that almost all garbage should be burned. That
Right.
can be burned. You can recycle solar because some of the materials in a solar panel are valuable. You can recycle batteries because the metals in the batteries are valuable. There's nothing valuable in an epoxy wind turbine blade because it's not like you can just make another wind turbine blade with it. You degrade the plastic while you're doing the recycling. And
Yeah.
so if it doesn't have anything valuable in it, you should burn it. And that's what we see. But of course, environmentalists are opposed to this because, CO2 emissions. And so we end up landfilling it and capturing the methane, which is fine. But by and large, with proper pollution controls, the best thing we could be doing with our garbage is to burn it.
Waste energy is a great thing.
Yeah, you get some energy out of it. You get a second bite of the apple. We wrote about this Chevron refinery once where the environmentalists were opposing it, where they basically just take milk jugs and put them back in. Because again, refineries know how to do this, but they were opposed to that too. Anything that makes cheap and abundant energy available to the population is opposed by environmentalists as a knee-jerk reaction.
Exactly. Yes.
Messy Times has a real question. He or she says, I spent a long time speaking with some plasma energy from garbage companies. Whatever happened to them?
Can't say I'm too familiar with plasma energy. The word plasma triggers what we would call our grift bin up there with graphene and anything with the word nano in front of it. Not saying that that's what's occurring here, but the people that I know in the waste management industry just run really sophisticated ovens with with pollution controls on them, and they generate steam and they could make electricity from it in some cases. And so broadly speaking, it's kind of like junior miners, like in the energy space, there's a fair bit of, I'm trying to be careful with my words, questionable claims being made. I'm not saying that this is an example of it, but the brand of the word plasma, to me, a brand is the gut feeling induced when you interact with a product or word. The brand gut feeling that I get when I see the word plasma is Griffin. Could be
Can
wrong.
I make
Joanna?
one more point about the nightmare with wind decommissioning, and that is the foundations with
Sure.
tons and tons of concrete and rebar in the ground that's going to be there forever. Okay, because no state has the regulatory structure to require those things to be rebated and or restored, and the land to be restored to original condition. And so those enormous foundations, hundreds and hundreds of them all over the countryside now, are the responsibility of the landowner. They're going to become the responsibility of the landowner. They're going to get left in the ground, and they're going to permanently condemn millions of acres of otherwise usable and even arable land in this country and all over the world.
So this brings up a whole other vertical that we could discuss, which is we live in flyover country, and we invest in farmland ourselves, and when people ask us, because there's all kinds of money coming into the farm world right now from Wall Street, private equity, looking to engage in what we call regulatory arbitrage, I'm seeing here that somebody's objecting to our use of the word grift. Could be. So back to your question about the wind turbines and foundations. We've always advised any farmers who reach out to us that you do not lease your land to these people. You're cutting a contract with an LLC that can file for bankruptcy and leave you on the hook. Sell them if they want to buy your land for a really stupid price. Hit the bid. Selling is fine because then it's like buying an entire business versus just buying the assets of a business. Sell them the land. We would never lease our land to a solar developer or a wind developer because then, as you say, who are you going to sue?
Yeah.
When the time comes,
Exactly.
they will have long pocketed the incentives. Look, take rooftop solar, for example. We observe this market pretty closely. This is basically tax credit harvesting for rich people at Goldman Sachs. That's essentially what is going on in that space. And so you agree to put solar panels on your home, and then you engage in a long-term contract with the people that pay to install it. And then that future stream of payments is packaged and sold off, and the tax credits are harvested by the installers and are used to help wealthy people avoid paying taxes. This is what rooftop solar is. The current embodiment of quote unquote solar companies in the US are actually just financing companies. They're best thought of as the front end of Wall Street bundling of future cash flows and extraction of credits from the Inflation Reduction Act and various other pieces of legislation that are meant to support the green energy transition.
Did you say Porculus Bill by Dan? Yeah, Porculus Bill. Thank you.
Porculus Bill, right? And so, but this is how people need to see. So one of the things that we always do is follow the money. Like, let's just see where does the money come into an ecosystem and where does it go out.
Yeah.
And if you trace the money, you can then see. So, for example, the variable interest entities that are created from these solar companies show you there's thousands of them under each of the publicly listed solar companies. They exist to create financial products for Wall Street to then enable wealthy people to pay less taxes. That's at its core what it is.
Yeah. And then you'll have natural asset companies coming up, which will allow corporations to basically write off whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah, well, that's a whole
nother.
Yeah, we actually wrote about that a few months ago, but it is truly very difficult to actually get your hands around just how crazy it all seems. But this, again, is just another scheme. The piece we wrote back in February was called Measurement Army. Just think of all the people that will have to do all of this measuring in order to track what's actually going on. But natural asset companies are an interesting phenomenon. I don't think they're going to become what the proponents of them hope they will become. I think this is a step too far, is our view.
Measurement Army, I call them warrior accountants with all the sustainability stuff.
Well, I mean, I have a friend at a big company who's a chief sustainability officer, and he told us off the record for a piece that we wrote on the sort of the great army of measures. He has more people counting carbons than he has researching ways to abate them. It's just a giant. There's an entire tax on the Western economy of this blob of measurers and public affairs people and sustainability people that are all really on the backs of, if you break it down, the oil workers in the shale patch are supporting the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and so it can't go on at this pace. It surely won't. I mean, we're starting to see some pushback now.
Doomberg, we got about one more minute here.
Sure.
And I tell you what, I am so happy that you stopped by again. Thank you, Tammy, for running the show today.
Yeah,
I didn't do much. Here's one last comment from Robert. I'd just like to read out. He said, "We have sanctimonious hypocrites in power on account of their sanctimonious hypocrisy suits the current public ignorance." And then Daryl Polston wanted to add, "All peas under the walnut shell."
I do have a one short quick video, and I want everybody to watch this. This is what I think our political outlook is going to be for the rest of the year. But watch the camera guy in the middle of the road. So hang on and watch the camera guy. All right, now watch this. Look at that! I think we're in for a heck of a year.
I'm motivated to get at the rest of my day after watching that.
Oh, boy.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Doomberg.
Thank you, Doomberg, for joining us today. Thank
Thanks,
you to
everyone,
all
for
our
chiming in.
watchers. Yeah, for sure.
Bye,
Y'all
guys.
have a great week.
Thank you.